This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The most recent book in the series is Animal Activism on and Off Screen, edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Herring. Contributors include the former Knowing Animals guest Eva Haifa-Giraud. If this book sounds interesting to you, I encourage you to reach out to your library and ask them to order a copy. Now today I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Juliette Waterman. Juliette is a zooarchaeologist with a particular interest in the archaeology of wild animals in Britain and especially in birds. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Reading in the UK, where she co-coordinates the International Council for Archaeozoology Stable Isotope Working Group. Today, we're going to talk about her paper Human-Raptor Relationships in Urban Spaces, the History of Red Kites and Human Food in Britain. This paper was published in The Hand That Feeds, The Complex Relations of Human-Animal Feeding, a book from UCL Press published in 2025. Juliette co-edited this volume with Alexander Mullen, Riley Smallman and Herder Bont. Now the volume is open access, and that means you can freely and legally download the book wherever you are in the world. But I should add that it's not actually released until the 13th of May, which is in a few weeks' time from the time of recording. But I've been lucky enough to have an early sneak preview. Welcome to the podcast, Juliette.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Could you start by telling us how this book came about?
So the Animal Feeding Project kind of designed this output, which was to be an edited volume, a collection of essays and kind of chapters written by the early career researchers that are on the project. And we're all from completely different disciplines. We've got anthropologists, zooarchaeologists, historians, all sorts. But all of our work is on the theme of animal feeding.
I see. So what brings the chapters in this volume together? Is it the fact that it's humans actively feeding these animals? Is it about the fact that we don't want to feed these animals? What's going on here?
The unifying theme is kind of almost the fringes maybe of animal feeding. We're kind of focusing on the aspects of animal feeding that people don't associate typically with that behaviour. We call it non-utilitarian feeding often in the book, and it's kind of feeding not just for the sake of the output. You know, you're not just feeding an animal to kind of achieve an aim that is to do with that animal's nutrition necessarily. It's about engagement, it's about enjoyment in some ways, and also the impacts that that has on animals and humans as well. So we're kind of moving away from the associations with livestock maybe that people have when they think of animal feeding, although there are book chapters that talk about livestock animals, but they take a slightly different perspective than what you'd maybe expect from a kind of pure nutritionally informed point of view.
And this animal feeding project, was that based at the University of Reading?
No, it was spread across a few different universities, including the University of Exeter, the University of Roehampton as well, the National Museum of Scotland, and it was funded by the Wellcome Trust.
Before we get to your chapter, I really wanted to pick up on some of the weird and wonderful chapters that are here, because you address such a diversity of different topics. So, first of all, I was really drawn to Gaia Motea's chapter, I live off them, they live off me, exploring the human flea feeding relationship in the history of flea circuses. Could you introduce us to her work?
Gaia, my friend and colleague, is a fantastic entomologist who's been looking at external parasites to better understand what they can tell us about their hosts. But as part of that, she's done a bit of a deep dive into kind of the history of parasitic insects, basically, and to understand better kind of the relationships they've had with humans and, you know, the way they literally feed off of us. So her chapter on flea circuses provides a bit of a deep dive into this tradition, and it's certainly a very unique perspective and a great read.
Yeah, I agree. And what kind of disciplinary perspective is she coming from then?
So she's an entomologist with kind of a background also in stable isotope analysis, like myself.
Sorry, what's stable isotope analysis? That sounds very sciencey.
No, great question, because it kind of informs kind of most of what I'm doing. It's just a biochemical technique that can be applied to animal or human tissues, and it's used a lot by zooarchaeologists to understand animal diets and how animals move around in the past. But it's also used by ecologists today as well for the same reason. So it can be applied to any kind of animal tissue really, but usually bones or feathers, things like that.
And that contrasts so strongly with the next chapter I was going to mention, from the kind of very scientific to the, well, still experimental, but very much artistic. And that was Alex Mullen's chapter, which was called The Adventures of a Birch Branch, or a narrative ethnography of browse feeding at the Highland Wildlife Park. What's going on in that chapter?
Yeah, I think that's a real strength of the book. We've come at it from such different perspectives and such different kind of disciplinary backgrounds. And Alex Mullen is a fantastic ethnographer who's been doing an amazing project based at Edinburgh Zoo. But this chapter is for anyone who's ever wondering what the experience of animal vegetation forage is like from start to finish, from its life as kind of a living plant right up to it being fed to animals in a zoo. If that's ever a journey you've wanted to know about, then this is the chapter for you.
Yeah, but it's not just about that journey. It's got that, I would say, weird, I hope he doesn't mind me saying that,
I'm
but
sure
this
not.
weird methodological element of almost fiction writing, kind of creative fiction writing.
It definitely has a real kind of storytelling flair that I think fits well with the sort of ethnographic approach of enmeshing yourself in your research subject, be they human or animal or plant.
Great. Well, hopefully that'll give listeners a sample of the diversity of the things going on in the book, and a reminder that in a few weeks' time from time of recording, they'll be able to read all of it for free. So I encourage them all to have a look. But let's turn to your chapter, which was called Human-Raptor Relationships in Urban Spaces, the History of Red Kites and Human Food in Britain. I suppose the first thing to say is that this isn't the only chapter in the volume about red kites. There's also one from Ginny Thomas, who's a former guest on Knowing Animals. Listeners might remember a really fascinating conversation we had about categorising cats in Scotland and New Zealand, feral cats and wild cats and these kinds of things. Now, like you, Juliette, I'm British and I'm a bird watcher. So red kites have a kind of special place in my heart. But for the benefit of listeners who don't really know what red kites are, what's their story?
For those who've never seen one, a red kite is kind of a medium-sized raptor. They're very distinctive. They have a forked tail that makes them easy to identify if you do see one. They're active in the daytime and they scavenge, so they're very visible in the landscape if you're in an area where they're found. You'll see them often along motorways. They love kind of scavenging on roadkill. And seeing them kind of frequently is a privilege only really given to us in the last few decades, because for most of the 20th century they were critically endangered in the UK. They were kind of a very small relict population just in Wales, where they, I think, are still officially considered to be the sort of, well, unofficial national bird of Wales because of this. That was where they survived, but they were kind of translocated from Wales and also from other European countries into England and Scotland in the 1980s and the 1990s. And since then, they've really thrived. The population keeps growing. In fact, we've since swapped chicks back to Europe, where the kind of European range of the red kite, they're not doing as well compared to here, which is fantastic, obviously, because it means that our population is thriving. But on a global scale, they're still kind of in a bit of trouble. But the thing that's quite unique about their post-reintroduction population is that they don't behave in the way that was maybe envisaged at the time of reintroduction. You know, they were reintroduced to the Chiltern Hills and to kind of the Scottish Highlands, where it was... The idea was these are kind of mosaic countrysides with farmland where things were quite remote and the birds would be able to feed kind of in the wild. And this idea of wildness and naturalness kind of comes up a lot in conversations about reintroductions. And red kites, because they're scavengers, they're excellently placed to take advantage of human foods and even human foods in urban settings. So they kind of come into towns, they feed in people's gardens, they're kind of bold is a word that's often thrown around, which I don't necessarily like because I think it has slightly negative connotations, but they're certainly unafraid of humans in terms of they're willing to kind of come and get quite close to people to take food, and they're not bothered at all by kind of even city centre foraging, really, which is quite exciting in some ways. It's often viewed as quite negative because it's counteracting this idea of wildness. You know, they should be in the wild, they shouldn't be in our towns, which I do see that that's a valid approach, but to some extent there isn't really any wild landscapes truly left in the UK, or there are very, very few that are kind of completely unadulterated. So I think from a pragmatic point of view of kind of working with what we've got, examples of animals that are able to thrive in kind of urban and semi-urban environments are really useful and should be kind of appreciated for what they are rather than kind of for what they're not, which is an example of a reintroduced animal doing exactly what it was expected to do.
Well, this is great. So there's a kind of complexity to the success story of their reintroduction. The numbers are high, but they're perhaps not behaving as they were expected to. I feel the pull of what you're saying, by the way, in that there's this irony that we artificially add the animals to the landscape and then expect them to be completely natural. That's strange. So why was it that they needed this help? What was the problem that this conservation success story was responding to?
So as with many animals in the UK, it's a bit of a sad story of persecution. In the case of red kites, they're kind of very easy to kill in a lot of ways, even if they're not the target animal. Obviously, they've kind of always been unpopular from kind of things like if you're trying to protect young game birds, they'll take them. So that's no good if you're a gamekeeper and wants to protect your stock. Also, if you're putting out poison for other animals or traps or things like that, because they're scavengers, they just, they'll kind of fall victim to that very easily. But the persecution actually started a very, very long time ago, and you can trace it back to the Tudor vermin laws that were passed in the 16th century that kind of targeted animals that were considered to be pests or vermin. People could kind of collect bounties if they brought in the heads of these animals to their local church warden. Although I will say that for red kites, most of the kind of more intense persecution happens in the kind of the 17th and 18th centuries onwards. And in fact, there's some kind of contentious evidence that they may have even been legally protected in the kind of later medieval period, which is very interesting. And they certainly were numerous in medieval cities and kind of medieval towns, it would seem, which is really, really interesting, especially when you think about kind of what they're doing now in urban landscapes. So in some ways, maybe not such a surprise that post-reintroduction they've kind of colonized towns. But I think there's just something so interesting about the scavenging dietary ecology and how it enables animals to kind of live very closely alongside humans and kind of take advantage of what we're doing in the landscape and put their stamp on sort of urban settings.
I'm glad you mentioned this contentious evidence about the protection in medieval British cities or English cities, because that really struck me when I was reading your chapter. Because one of the things, well, the suggestion that seems to be made is that these animals were protected precisely because they were scavenging.
Yeah.
And that's almost exactly the opposite to what we expect today when we think of scavenging animals in an urban environment are considered the kind of the most horrible thing, there's something that people don't want to see.
I think there's a lot of interesting discussion about animals and kind of cleanliness and dirt. And, you see it a lot in the context of kind of urban pigeons or rats and things like that. And animals are often really, really vilified for kind of their association with kind of dirtiness. To some extent, for red kites in medieval London, that association may not have harmed them, because if you're living in a city where sanitation is a constant battle and where kind of waste disposal is just kind of something that people are having to negotiate every day with, mixed success, having animals that are kind of taking that rubbish away from where you have to look at it and where you have to smell it is maybe very valuable. And yeah, kind of there's been some differences of opinion as to whether there was actually a law in place that legally protected them, but it certainly was something that was repeated by a lot of contemporary authors. So people at the time seemed to think that it was true, and that maybe suggests that there were kind of attitudes that were, I would struggle to say positive, because I don't know how positive it is, but at least neutral or kind of, not actively harming them. And I think maybe that's something that we need to bear in mind now when we think about wildlife in urban spaces, is that sometimes you can be a bit inconvenienced by wild animals. The price you pay for kind of having skies that aren't empty and silent is that kind of occasionally things can be a bit annoying. There's some kind of quite controversial examples of red kites where they've snatched food from barbecues and things like that, and it's kind of people are blamed for feeding them on purpose, which obviously is quite controversial as well. But to some extent, if we're going to live alongside animals and we're going to kind of focus on not losing this sort of lovely biodiversity that we have to be willing to put up with animals that occasionally behave in ways that do slightly inconvenience us.
Oh, absolutely. You're speaking my language now. But let me ask a little bit about the disciplinary contribution, because you talk about, the legal history and reading these reports. And I love the discussion in your chapter about looking at the numbers of animals' heads or pelts that were claimed in different times and different places, and how much money people got for them. Really fascinating historical documentary analysis. But of course, you're an archaeologist. So what can archaeology add to these conversations?
Yeah, of course. So I really tried to do justice to the fantastic historians who've written about this kind of subject and about wildlife history in general when I was pulling together this chapter. But the intention was to kind of inform an archaeological study which has since been published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, where we looked at the actual archaeological raptor bones of birds of prey, which includes red kites, but we also looked at buzzards and white-tailed eagles from kind of archaeological settlements across England, and analyze them using the stable isotopes approach that I talked about earlier to understand a bit more about what they're eating. And the results were really interesting. It seems like they really are eating a high percentage of kind of what we'd call anthropogenic food. You know, they kind of plot quite closely with humans from the same sites. They're plotting like predators of livestock animals, which, you know, they're not actively predating on livestock. There's absolutely no way that a red kite is hunting anything near the size of a cow. So that's them kind of scavenging on human foods. Basically, that's butchery waste or kind of household waste. And it's something that we knew about before because, of course, the documentary sources talk about them snatching food and kind of eating waste. But what the study found that was new is the scale of it. You know, this is not a supplementary food for these birds. It's kind of like their main dietary source. They're really kind of specializing on these kind of anthropogenic foods in urban landscapes, which is a really interesting finding because it suggests that they're kind of really occupying an urban niche kind of to the full extent.
That's fascinating. And so did you notice in this second study any differences in time period? Because that was one of the things you charted in this chapter, was how there was a changing relationship with these birds from potentially protected to targeted as vermin to eliminated in various ways.
The trend that we saw seems to peak in the medieval period. It seems like these kind of medieval birds are the ones that are the most dependent on livestock compared to kind of earlier sort of examples of animals that are from kind of Roman or Iron Age sites where the urban density is a bit lower. Although I should caveat this by saying that my sample sizes obviously were not large because wild birds in the archaeological record are quite rare. So we were kind of doing the best we could with what we had. But it does seem like there's something quite distinctive happening in medieval Britain, and that obviously is backed up by the sources as well. It was a really interesting story, I think, that came out of that study, kind of birds in Britain in the past, but also what it tells us about what they're doing now and what they may continue to do in the future.
Now, it's fascinating. Did you just mention Iron Age as well? Because that suggests that this association between humans and red kites goes way back. And you think of urban foxes, right? That being something that, by a lot of accounts, please contradict me if I'm wrong, but that's a very modern phenomenon. That's something we've only seen over the last few decades. But red kites, it sounds, have been associated closely with humans for a very long time.
So I had a conversation over email with Stephen Harris recently, who's done a lot of work on urban foxes, and he raised a really excellent point, which is that kites are very quick. They're able to come in and out as quick as you like, really, which again, it's part of their kind of biology that makes them ideal urban scavengers because they're not really at risk in the same way that something like a fox is from humans, but also from things like, you know, dogs, feral dogs that maybe are in towns. But, you know, a kite is able to kind of take full advantage because they're sort of operating on so many more planes of movement, if that makes sense. So yeah, they just really are kind of set up in an ideal way to be a town dweller. And studies by my PhD supervisor, Mark Fellows at the University of Reading, and colleagues found that although they are kind of coming into the cities to feed, they're not breeding particularly close. They kind of travel quite long distances. They roost in the countryside, they breed in the countryside where it maybe is a bit safer and a bit less disrupted for them. But because they're such mobile animals, they're kind of really able to take advantage of built-up environments in a way that other sort of scavenging animals aren't quite, or maybe weren't able to in the past.
You mentioned the low sample sizes. Where do raptor bones appear in the archaeological record?
So for the species that I'm studying, although I should say that for falconry birds, which is a whole different beast, and red kites are never used as falconry birds, they're not very good hunters, frankly. You should check out my colleague Hannah Britton's chapter in The Hand That Feeds. But they're often found in special deposits. They're buried as whole skeletons. This is not the case with scavenging birds. They're kind of incidental additions to rubbish pits, basically, middens, kind of cesspits, that sort of thing. So they're not treated with any kind of ritual reverence or anything like that. They are just kind of in mixed deposits of other animal bone, basically. So kind of household refuse and vertebrate scavengers that have ended up mixed in with it.
Let me ask you a question that maybe doesn't suit your training, your background, but I hope you have an informed view on. What do you think's the future for red kites? So I was saying just before we started recording that I live within a couple of miles of the centre of York, and I know that there's a very long history of red kites here in York.
Yeah.
But I saw a kite from my back garden last week. Do you think we'll start to see them arriving more and more back into the cities? Do you think that that raises the risk that they might be reclassified not as these impressive birds that we see on the sides of roads or in the countryside, but as vermin again?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a danger that they're likely to be a victim of bad press, for sure. And I think that's why I really dislike words like pest and vermin. I think it's such an unuseful way to talk about animals. And the way that also people bandy the term around like it's an official category, it's kind of like, oh, well, they're becoming pests. And it's sort of, what does that mean? Does it just mean that you feel annoyed by them? Does it mean that other people feel annoyed by them? So I think there's a certain level of kind of pragmatism, as I've said earlier, that we kind of need to learn to get along with animals, even if they are kind of causing problems and snatching food to some extent, because although they are common in Britain in some areas, they are, in trouble in other parts of their natural range. But yeah, I think they absolutely will continue to kind of come into towns because there's no reason for them not to. I think, again, this idea of naturalness, coming back to that, I've had conversations with a few people where they've said, oh, it's not natural behavior that they're kind of coming and taking human food. It really is natural behavior. They're scavengers. Actually, in the wild, they will steal food from things like foxes or canids and snatch prey from other carnivores because that's what a lot of scavenging animals do. It's kind of crows and gulls do it as well. It is a completely natural behavior. It just doesn't feel natural when they do it to humans because we kind of view ourselves as separate. So I think we can expect more of that. And it's just what we choose to then do with this kind of reality and whether we're kind of happy to live alongside them or whether it's going to cause more problems. But I would like to think that now, kind of 21st century kind of town dwellers maybe feel a bit differently than people in the Tudor period, and we're not going to go full circle and start kind of wanting them gone, but maybe that's a little bit too optimistic.
I share your hopes, and maybe I'd like to be optimistic. I think I compare them to peregrines, right?
Yeah.
Who have arrived in the cities now in Britain, and people love them. They're so impressive, they're so distinctive and so welcome, and I just hope that the kites will be treated in the same kind of way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, Juliette, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, feel free to interpret these questions as you like. That's part of it, is understanding how you think of them. So, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So unless we're counting Black Beauty as a piece of scholarship, which I suspect maybe it doesn't count, then I think my answer would be Roger Lovegrove's Silent Fields, which I would say the best way to describe it is kind of a love letter to the birds of kind of the British countryside and the way that we're losing them. And then he has a fantastic chapter on red kites that kind of is great further reading for anyone who's interested to learn more about them. But he talks about kind of, so many different kind of our native species and especially birds.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So again, if we're kind of sticking to serious scholarship, it's actually the book chapter that we've been discussing because it derives heavily from the literature review that I was putting together in the very first year of my PhD back in 2020. So although it's only just coming out now, it's kind of from the very first piece of work that I did when I kind of was really getting to grips with the literature about kites and their history in the UK and the importance of their role as a scavenger in sort of urban environments.
If you could name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So I think in terms of kind of the animal studies and kind of environmental humanities in a stricter sense, Dolly Jurgensen has been kind of such a fantastic inspiration just in terms of the way she uses sort of environmental history to understand kind of wild animals. But also our whole animal feeding project team are all from different disciplines, but they kind of have done such fantastic work on animals ranging from kind of isotope projects to ethnography that I would kind of cheat and maybe say the whole animal feeding team in some ways.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
From my perspective, I think abandoning the idea of kind of wildness as a very pure concept that is kind of the be all and end all when it comes to conservation is a really crucial one. And it feels like a very similar approach is kind of the, perfect is the enemy of good, because I think sometimes when people focus on conservation where wildness is the ultimate goal at the expense of maybe kind of a more pragmatic approach that still enhances biodiversity. And especially also, it's not just from the point of view of actual conservationists doing actual conservation work, but also the idea that wildness is what we should all be striving for can be quite harmful to how people view animals, because it then means that when you view things as no longer wild, the public is more likely to kind of have a negative perception of them as well. So it's not just about kind of, striving for wildness in a reintroduction effort, but it's also about kind of prizing wildness above all else when you're talking about animals or thinking about animals.
That's a great answer. And it's interesting. I mentioned Ginny Thomas earlier. We talked about exactly the same thing when she was on the podcast. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think this answer is also going to be quite similar to a lot of Ginny's work, because again, it's about categories. And I would love to eliminate the category of pest and vermin, because I think it's so unhelpful and it has done such harm to so many different animal species over such a long period of time, that I think if we were to no longer have the capacity to kind of categorize an animal as a pest and write it off completely, that I think that would go a long way towards helping kind of wild animals across the world.
What are you working on next?
I've been working on a few things that are along the same theme of kind of using stable isotopes to better understand wild animals. I've got some fantastic colleagues that are part of my kind of research group. We've been working on kind of a variety of species from foxes to seabirds. And we're especially interested in museum collections and how natural history collections, but also other aspects of museums like textiles can kind of be records of environmental histories. So we're planning some kind of up and coming projects on that theme. So fingers crossed. But we've got some things in the works on that note.
Is this still all focusing on Britain, or is there a kind of international element as well?
We've mostly focused on Britain for now, but there are kind of hopes to maybe expand that across Europe as well.
How can people find out more about this project and the rest of your work?
So the book, The Hand That Feeds, is available from UCL Press, and I strongly encourage everyone to check it out, because you'll be able to look at it online, open access, very easily. But also you can follow me personally. I have accounts across various social media platforms under the name Juliette Waterman.
Well, thanks so much, Juliette, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been fantastic.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook. I'm on X at Josh L. Milburn. I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher, and I'm on Blue Sky at Josh Milburn. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.